بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا والحقنا بعبادك الصالحين. آمين آمين. In our last video we spoke about why and how to learn the Arabic language, and I mentioned a few methods. I just want to elaborate on these methods. I mentioned 3 methods, however there are 4 generally known methods that are used to learn the Arabic language. The most popular of these methods, which is actually just a buy-in and is an objective based method, is the method what they call Quranic Arabic. And in my opinion, there's no such thing as Quranic Arabic. It doesn't exist, and I'll elaborate why. So that's the first method, Quranic Arabic. What's meant by Quranic Arabic? Well, the objective of every person or every Muslim, or one of the objectives, if not the main one, to learn the Arabic language is to understand the Quran. So a method is sold to the people to say that you want to learn the Quran, we will teach you Quranic Arabic, meaning you will understand the Quran and the Arabic in the Quran totally detached from any other Arabic or modern standard Arabic, hence attaining your objective. And in my opinion, that is impossible. I'll tell you why. To learn a language, certain steps need to be taken. You need to have certain amount of vocabulary. You need to have natural understanding of certain skills that every language requires. And then after that, you will be able to understand the language. So in the Quranic method, what's told to you is that the Quran has so many words. These words are the most often occurring words in the Quran, and memorize these words, and then we do a read through of the Quran and we will explain the meanings, and if you know the words you'll understand. And some grammar and morphology is taught, but not really much. This method here cannot teach you the language. Why? Because even if you know most of the words in the Quran and you memorize them, those words come in different forms. For example, if they are verbs, they come in different forms, they morph. Past tense, present tense, future tense, passive, active. The verbs may come in also different, depending on the pronouns which are attached to them. They'll change, they'll differ. So to learn one word and then expect to recognize that word when it morphs into its different forms would be impossible, firstly. Secondly, nouns, singular and plural. Would you know them? The prepositions and the adverbs and all of these things, dependent on their position in a sentence, have different meanings. The same nouns and verbs, dependent on their position or the topic, have different usages and different meanings. So how is it possible that a person can naturally then understand and attain an understanding? Because the rhetoric of the Quran in itself also differs. So dependent on the rhetoric, those words and those phrases and those verbs and those prepositions and adverbs will carry different meanings. So what would happen is that a student would learn a certain amount of words, have no practical application of those words, dive straight into the Quran, not understanding any aspects of language naturally, not attaining any skills, and thereafter being expected to understand the rhetoric in the way that it was intended. Impossible. Point of an example. If I were to tell you that you could understand Shakespearean English and understand the books of Shakespeare by just studying his books, totally detached from the English language, meaning if me and you had to have a conversation today, you would not understand what I would be saying, but open Shakespeare, you'll understand it. Doesn't make sense. Also, the grammatical construct of the Arabic language is extremely logical and methodical. So for one to expect to understand something without understanding that logic and method of the grammar, besides having it, without any grammar, you understand the Quran? Impossible. Without any morphology or understanding of it, impossible. Without having the skill of interpreting the language naturally, the skills of reading, writing, listening, and expressing naturally, understanding it, impossible. So basically what happens, you do a read through of the Quran, they tell you these things mean this, and at the end of it, if you were to hear ayah out of context without you having revised it, you wouldn't understand it. So you wouldn't have attained any objective. This method does not work. However, if used with one of the other methods, thereafter, we supplement it with this method. Yes, it can speed up the process of learning the meanings of the Quran. That's the first method, which is, in my opinion, just a selling point. People say it's an objective-based method and you can learn the Quran through something called Quranic Arabic, which doesn't exist, because essentially the rules of modern standard Arabic and Quranic Arabic are the same rules. So if you were to learn the rules of modern standard Arabic, you would be attaining your objective naturally to get to understanding the Quran. That's the first method, and like I said, it's a fallacy. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as Quranic Arabic. I'm yet to see anybody who understands the Quran in the way it was intended, understands the rhetoric, listens to it without having to go through a book and write down things, and can understand it immediately without having any background. I'm yet to find somebody like this. There's nobody. So they say they can't speak the language, you don't understand when people speak it, but we understand Quranic Arabic. And that's what's sold to many people. And I have many students and people who come to me and tell me we're learning Arabic, Quranic Arabic for the past 5 years and 10 years and 15 years. Their understanding of the language is minimal. The second method is a method used by institutions and academies and universities in the Middle East and in the Arab lands. And this method is a skill-based method. This method here is a natural method, meaning that the language is conveyed to the student in a manner that a child would learn the language from listening and hearing and speaking and so on and so forth, meaning developing the skills. The 4 skills that are used in this method are the skills of reading, qira'ah, of expressing, ta'bir, of listening, istima', and of writing, kitaba. These skills are taught in a manner where you learn them naturally and progressively. Now the advantage to this method is that the person picks up the language naturally, so he becomes more efficient and fluent when speaking and listening and conversing, and even writing. His skills become honed in, obviously. However, the disadvantage is that this method here requires you to be in an environment which is conducive to learning, meaning you have to be around native speakers of the language or people who speak the language, so that you may pick up the different ways and uses of words and phrases, and you may be able to take the language in the same way a child takes it in. He needs an environment. The other disadvantage of this method is that this method here is extremely memory and time intensive. You need time because you need to be practicing all the time. You need a good memory because you need to remember what you hear, what you read, what you see. And the third disadvantage of this method is this method here, if you're a person who's methodical and logical, would take a long time for you to see method. So you'll see fruits very fast. You'll be able to say certain things. However, you won't understand what's exactly happening. You'll be able to converse a bit, use phrases that you have heard, use things that you've read, but you won't be able to manipulate the language to suit your situation. And the last disadvantage is that you need people around you who are constantly correcting the way you speak, so that you may correct your speech. People who are constantly around you when you read, so you need to read out aloud, so that you can correct your reading. You need constantly to be asking questions about things that you hear, so that you may understand what you heard and you didn't understand. So you ask somebody, what did you say? Why did you say it? Why is it like that? Can I say this? Can't I say this? Obviously, that's some of the difficulties. However, the method works quite well and it's what's used in the Middle East and in certain academies and institutes. The third method is the logical method. The method where they use, it's a logical method where they use grammar and morphology to teach the language from first principles. And this method here is used in the West, and it's used in the Indo-Pak and generally in non-Arab lands, where methodically the language is conveyed to a student, where the structures of a language are shown, and then a student learns the Arabic language. And Arabic in itself is an extremely methodical and logical language, where structures do exist with minimal exceptions. So the language can be taught like this. However, this method here, even though you may see fruits early, you see, oh, I'm building a sentence, I'm doing certain things. This method, the disadvantage is that you are not practicing the skills that you acquire. You don't learn enough vocabulary. You don't see your sentences that you build or the skills that you acquire and apply them. You don't see them in a process where they are used in real life situations. So you don't actually develop skills, meaning you lose out on the first method. The other disadvantage of this method is that a person becomes too analytical. You need to analyze everything to understand how to build on something. And that's problematic as well. Because a language, even though this Arabic language may be logical and methodical, there are certain aspects which show flair in the language, where there's rhetoric, where there's exceptions, where different things can be applied in different manners. So to teach a person the language from first principles with everything in place is not possible. So it is adhesive, but a person does not get complete cohesion except after a long time. And that's a disadvantage with all the methods. But the advantage of this method is that a person develops structure. They understand the language. They can manipulate certain things in a language to fit certain situations. However, they lack the skills to do that. So this is where the last method of learning Arabic comes in. And there is the fourth method, where it's a mixed method between the logical approach by learning grammar and morphology and the skill-based approach by honing in on your skills, meaning teaching the language naturally, the natural approach and the logical approach. In my opinion, this method works the best. The way that this method needs to be carried out also needs to be correct. If it's carried out incorrectly, you won't yield the same results that you are looking for. And inshallah, I'll speak about this method, which is a mix between the natural method and the skills-based method, in a separate video. And I'll explain to the students and to listeners about the method or the approach that I take when applying this method. And inshallah, we can all benefit. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen.